Somewhere beneath the frozen ground of Canada, there are doors that don't open from the inside. That's not a metaphor. That's not the opening line of a horror novel. That is a documented architectural feature found in tunnel systems stretching from the bedrock under Quebec City, down through the carved corridors beneath Ottawa, running west through passages that honeycomb the ground below Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and extending further still into British Columbia, into Alberta, into the remote territories where no colonial settler ever claimed to have done any digging. Doors that don't open from the inside. Think about what that means for a moment. Every door ever built by human beings. Every door in every house, every bunker, every underground structure from the Roman catacombs to the Cold War missile silos was built with the assumption that someone on the other side would eventually need to leave. That is the fundamental logic of a door. You open it to go in. You open it to come out. That is the entire purpose of the mechanism. Unless the people who built it never intended to come back out, or unless the people who built it were not building a room, they were building a seal. This documentary is going to take you underground. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. We are going to go beneath the surface of one of the most geographically vast and historically mysterious nations on Earth, and we are going to look, really look, at what is sitting under the ground that generations of Canadians have walked over without ever asking why it feels hollow beneath their feet. We are going to look at a network of tunnels, chambers, shafts, and passages that runs for hundreds of kilometers beneath a country that, according to official history, was largely uninhabited wilderness until European explorers arrived 500 years ago. We are going to look at the structures left behind, and then we are going to ask the question that mainstream archaeology refuses to ask out loud. Who built them? Because here is what the official record tells us. Canada was settled by nomadic peoples crossing a land bridge from Asia approximately 15,000 years ago. These peoples were hunter-gatherers, sophisticated in their relationship with the land, but largely without permanent architecture, certainly without the industrial capacity required to carve tunnel systems through solid bedrock. Then Europeans arrived, the French in the 16th century, the British shortly after. They built what settlers build, above ground with timber and stone in the climates where such things make sense. None of them built what is sitting underground in Canada right now. And yet it is there, not as a rumor, not as folklore, not as the speculation of fringe theorists working out of their basements. The tunnels are documented. They have been surveyed in part. Government records reference them. Municipal engineering reports mention them. Some of them have been incorporated into modern infrastructure, repurposed, rerouted, sealed, or in a handful of cases, open to tourists as curiosities, as charming historical footnotes, with no serious attempt to explain their full extent or their original purpose. Because to explain their full extent would be to confront a problem that mainstream history is not equipped to solve. The problem is this: the construction methodology, the depth, the material removal, and the geographic scope of what lies under Canada is not consistent with any known civilization that occupied this continent within recorded history. It is consistent with something much older, something that operated at a scale of engineering that dwarfs what we credit to pre-Columbian North American peoples, something that suggests a level of organizational and technical sophistication that has no place in the story we have been told about human development on this continent. And when you start mapping what is underground against what we know, genuinely know, through archaeology, through geology, through the oral histories of the indigenous nations who lived above these structures for thousands of years, a different story starts to emerge. A story about cycles, a story about what came before, a story about a civilization so advanced, so deeply embedded in this land, that when it ended, and it did end catastrophically, in a way we are only beginning to understand, the only things it left behind were the parts of it that were already underground. The tunnels are not ruins. The tunnels are a message. And we are, if this evidence means what it appears to mean, the seventh attempt at receiving it. Let us establish first what we mean when we use the word civilization. Not the casual version, not the comfortable version where civilization means cities and writing and agriculture and the slow climb of progress from primitive to sophisticated. The deeper version, the version that geologists and systems theorists and catastrophist researchers have been arguing about for decades at the margins of academic discourse. A civilization, in the fullest sense of the word, is a self-organizing complex system. It takes raw material, energy, land, human labor, intellectual output, and it converts that raw material into structure, into built environment, into organized information, into the kind of layered, interconnected, reinforcing complexity that allows millions or even billions of individuals to function as something resembling a single organism. Every civilization that has ever existed has left evidence of that structure-building activity. The Egyptians left pyramids. The Romans left roads and aqueducts and the legal frameworks that still underpin Western governance. The Sumerians left written language. The Indus Valley civilization left urban planning so sophisticated that the drainage systems under Mohenjo-Daro were more advanced than those in most European cities 3,000 years later. We find these things, we dig them up, we date them, we put them in museums, and we build narratives around them, and we feel confident that we understand the arc of human history, because the physical evidence is there to walk us through it. But there is a problem with this confidence. It is a problem that geologists and catastrophists have been raising, cautiously, at the fringes of mainstream discourse for the better part of 2 centuries. And the problem is this: the geological record does not match the historical record, not even close. The geological record, the actual physical evidence embedded in the rock layers of this planet, shows multiple episodes of rapid, catastrophic change at intervals that are not consistent with slow, gradual processes. There are layers in the rock record that contain evidence of mass extinction, of global flood events, of dramatic climate shifts, of electromagnetic disturbances, of impacts from space, of volcanic episodes so vast they block sunlight across entire hemispheres. And between those catastrophic layers, there is always a period of relative stability, sometimes thousands of years, sometimes tens of thousands, always long enough for complex life to recover, always long enough for intelligence to emerge, to organize, to build something that deserves the word civilization, and then another catastrophe, and then another layer of destroyed complex evidence, and then again a period of stability, and something rising again from what survived. Researchers who work in what is called catastrophist or cyclic history, people like Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, Robert Schoch, and dozens of others less known but equally rigorous, have been building the case for decades that what we call human history is not the whole story, that it is instead the story of the most recent cycle, the story of the civilization that rose after the last great catastrophe, which the geological evidence places at approximately 11,600 years ago, at the end of a period called the Younger Dryas, a sudden violent climate event that geologists now broadly agree was caused at least in part by a series of impacts from a fragmenting comet that struck the North American ice sheet. The younger Dryas impact. Think about what the North American ice sheet means in this context. At the height of the last glacial maximum, Canada was buried under an ice sheet that in places reached 3 kilometers thick. 3 kilometers. The weight of that ice sheet was so enormous that it depressed the bedrock beneath it by hundreds of meters. The ground itself sank under the weight of the ice, and when the ice sheet destabilized, when it was hit in the Catastrophic model by an extraterrestrial impact event of sufficient scale, it did not melt gradually. It collapsed rapidly, cataclysmically. It sent sheets of meltwater rushing across the continent at speeds and volumes that carved the landscape we see today. The Great Lakes are a scar from that event. The channeled scablands of Washington State are a scar from that event. The carved valleys and eroded plateaus and redirected river systems across the entire northern half of this continent are scars from that event. And here is the part that nobody in mainstream academia wants to sit with for very long. If there was a civilization on this continent before that event, it would be gone, not damaged, not buried in a way that leaves easily findable ruins. Gone. Washed away, carved away, ground down, and redistributed across a continent under moving walls of water, carrying ice and rock at velocities that would strip anything above ground down to bedrock. Anything above ground. What was below ground might survive. What was already carved into the bedrock, deep enough, sealed tightly enough, might survive the passage of billions of tons of meltwater rushing across the surface above it. A tunnel might survive. A sealed chamber might survive. A network of passages cut deep into the granite bedrock of the Canadian Shield, which is some of the oldest and hardest rock on the surface of this planet, might not just survive a surface catastrophe of that scale. It might survive it almost perfectly. And this is where the story that we have been told, the story of pristine wilderness and hunter-gatherers and European discovery, starts to develop the kind of cracks that no amount of academic insistence on the established narrative can fully paper over. Because what is sitting under Canada is not consistent with wilderness. It is consistent with a civilization that knew what was coming and went underground before it arrived. Quebec City sits on a promontory of rock above the St. Lawrence River that the Indigenous Huron-Wendat people called Stadacona. When Samuel de Champlain arrived in 1608 and began establishing what would become the oldest continuously inhabited city in North America, north of Mexico, he built on top of what was already there. As colonial settlements grew into towns and towns grew into cities, the builders of Quebec dug. They dug cellars for their buildings. They dug wells for their water supply. They dug drainage channels and utility passages and the kinds of subterranean infrastructure that any growing settlement requires. And as they dug, they kept finding things they had not built. The underground of old Quebec City is today partially accessible to the public. There are tour operators who will take you through sections of it. There are portions that have been incorporated into the lower levels of hotels, restaurants, and public buildings. The official story presented to tourists is charming and historical. These are colonial-era tunnels, the guides explain. They were used for storage, for moving goods during harsh winters, for military communications during the various sieges and battles that punctuated the city's colonial history. And some of them were. The French built tunnels. The British built tunnels. The story of colonial underground infrastructure in Quebec City is real and reasonably well documented, but the colonial tunnels sit on top of something else. Engineers and excavators working beneath the old city in the 20th century, particularly during utility upgrades and construction projects in the latter half of the 1900s, repeatedly encountered tunnel sections that did not match the architectural vocabulary of colonial construction. The stonework in these deeper sections was different, not in a subtle way, in a fundamental way. Colonial tunnel construction in North America used rubble stone masonry, rough stones fitted together with mortar or in some cases timber framing. It was functional, it was adequate, and it was consistent with what European settlers knew how to build with the materials and tools they had available. The deeper sections were not rubble stone, they were cut, precisely cut, fitted together without mortar in a technique called ashlar masonry, where stones are cut to such precise tolerances that they lock together under their own weight, achieving a structural integrity that mortar construction cannot match. The same technique used in the construction of the Egyptian pyramids, the same technique found in the megalithic structures at Sacsayhuaman in Peru. The same technique documented at dozens of ancient construction sites across the world, all of which share the same uncomfortable characteristic. They are older than mainstream archaeology is comfortable admitting, and no one has a fully satisfying explanation for who built them or how. These deeper ashlar sections were not mapped in any colonial engineering record. They had no documentation. They appeared on no survey. They were simply there, beneath the colonial construction, as if the colonial builders had discovered them and built on top of them without ever recording what they had found. This pattern, finding precise, unmortared stonework beneath colonial construction, incorporated into the infrastructure without documentation or explanation, repeats itself across Canada with a frequency that is impossible to dismiss as coincidence. In Ottawa, the capital of Canada, there is an official tunnel network beneath Parliament Hill. It is documented. It is partially open to authorized personnel. The official explanation for its construction is straightforward. Tunnels were built in the 20th century for practical reasons, to connect the government buildings through the brutal Ottawa winters, to provide secure movement for personnel and materials in the post-war security environment. This explanation is true. Those tunnels were built in the 20th century for those reasons. But what the official explanation does not address is what the 20th century tunnelers found when they began excavating beneath Parliament Hill, a promontory of Nepean sandstone above the Ottawa River that had been a significant location for the Algonquin people for thousands of years before European arrival. What they found is not in the public record. This is itself significant. In a country with a reasonably robust tradition of governmental transparency, the geological and archaeological surveys conducted during the construction of the parliamentary tunnel network have never been released in full. Access to information requests have been filed. Some have been partially fulfilled, with sections redacted. The most consistent justification given for the redactions is national security. National security for geological surveys conducted during tunnel construction beneath a parliamentary complex. This is the kind of answer that raises more questions than it settles. What is known through the accounts of engineers and construction workers who worked on the Ottawa tunnels in various capacities over the decades is that the excavation work repeatedly encountered pre-existing passages, not cavities, not geological formations, passages, worked stone, evidence of prior human engineering at depths that no colonial or modern construction project could have reached before them. These passages were not investigated. They were not documented in released records. They were, by the accounts of those who encountered them, sealed, filled with concrete, incorporated into the new construction in ways that obliterated their previous configuration, or simply walled off and left behind as the new tunnels routed around them. Sealed. There is that word again. Moose Jaw is a small city in southern Saskatchewan, sitting on the flat, wind-scoured prairie about 75 kilometers west of Regina. It has a population of around 33,000 people. It has a charming old main street. It is not by any measure the kind of place that typically anchors theories about prehistoric civilizations and underground engineering mysteries. And yet Moose Jaw has what might be the most extensively documented and publicly accessible anomalous tunnel system in Canada. The tunnels under Moose Jaw were officially discovered, or rather officially acknowledged, in the 1980s when a section of Main Street collapsed into a void beneath the pavement. Subsequent investigation revealed a network of tunnels running beneath the downtown core, portions of which were eventually opened to tourists. The official explanation offered for these tunnels has shifted over time, which is itself telling. Initially, they were described as drainage tunnels, built to manage the seasonal flooding that plagues prairie cities. Then they were reframed as a network used by Chinese laborers during the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s, men who had been subjected to a racist head tax and other forms of legal persecution, and who had allegedly retreated underground to live and work out of reach of the authorities. This is a plausible and genuinely sympathetic story. Chinese workers were indeed subjected to horrific treatment during the construction of the CPR. It is entirely consistent with the historical record that persecuted workers would seek shelter underground. This explanation has been embraced with some enthusiasm, and the Moose Jaw Tunnel Tour includes a considerable amount of content about this chapter of Canadian history. The problem is that the tunnels are not consistent with this story either. The Chinese workers arrived in Moose Jaw in the 1880s. The tunnels beneath Moose Jaw, based on the engineering characteristics of their construction, are not 19th century excavations. The passages in the deeper sections, the ones that connect to the storm drainage and water table in ways that require a sophisticated understanding of local hydrology, are cut in a way that suggests they predate the railway, the settlement, and in some cases the geological period in which such cutting could have been accomplished with 19th century tools. The rock in southern Saskatchewan is predominantly Cretaceous sedimentary stone overlaying much older Precambrian basement. The cutting marks on portions of the Moose Jaw tunnel walls are not consistent with hand tools of any era. They are smooth, precisely smooth, in a way that is technically achievable with modern diamond-tipped cutting equipment and not easily achievable with anything that a 19th century labor crew, however large and however well supplied, could have brought to bear. Local historians in Moose Jaw have, for decades, noted that the oral traditions of the surrounding Cree and Assiniboine peoples reference the existence of underground passages in this area long before European settlement. These traditions do not describe the passages as something the Indigenous peoples built. They describe them as something that was already there when their own people arrived, something older than their own traditions, something that their most ancient stories describe as the work of a people who came before. A people who came before. This is not an isolated reference. This kind of oral tradition describing an underground infrastructure attributed to a pre-existing people rather than to the tradition holders themselves is found among Indigenous nations across the Canadian landscape. The Algonquin around Ottawa, the Huron-Wendat around Quebec, the Blackfoot on the prairies, the Haida and the Coast Salish in British Columbia. Different nations, different languages, different cultural frameworks, all carrying versions of the same account. There were people here before us. They built things underground. We do not know who they were, but their works are still beneath the earth. This is not folklore, or rather, it is folklore in the original sense. It is the preservation of actual historical knowledge in a narrative form that survives the passage of time without the need for written records. And when the same type of knowledge appears independently in multiple, unconnected cultural traditions across a continent, the working assumption of any serious historian should be that it is pointing at something real. To understand how an underground civilization, or more precisely, the underground remnants of a surface civilization that went underground before a catastrophe, could persist beneath Canada without being noticed or acknowledged for thousands of years, you have to understand the geology of the Canadian Shield. The Canadian Shield is one of the oldest exposed geological formations on Earth. It is a vast craton, a stable, ancient section of continental crust that underlies most of eastern and central Canada, from the Great Lakes north to the Arctic, from western Quebec through Ontario, Manitoba, and into parts of Saskatchewan. It is composed primarily of Precambrian igneous and metamorphic rock, granites and gneisses that formed between 1 billion and 4 billion years ago. It is among the hardest, most stable, and most durable rock types on the surface of this planet. This is important for two reasons. First, rock of this age and composition is extraordinarily difficult to cut or excavate. The modern mining industry, which has more experience cutting through the Canadian Shield than any other human enterprise, uses drill and blast methodology, drilling holes in the rock face, packing them with explosive charges, detonating the charges to break the rock, and then removing the broken material. It is slow, energy-intensive, and expensive. Prior to the development of modern explosives and pneumatic drilling equipment in the late 19th century, excavating through Precambrian granite at any significant depth and scale was essentially beyond the capacity of any known pre-industrial civilization. And yet, the passages that have been found in the Canadian Shield bedrock, not in the sedimentary rock of the prairies, not in the softer limestone and sandstone of the St. Lawrence lowlands, but in the ancient granite of the Shield itself, show no evidence of drill and blast methodology. They show no evidence of any percussive excavation technique at all. The walls of these deeper passages, in the sections that have been observed and described by people who encountered them during mining and construction operations, are smooth, not rough-hewn, not tool-marked in the way that any form of impact-based cutting leaves tool marks smooth, as if the rock had been removed by a process that did not involve striking it. This leads to the second reason the geology matters. Granite, under the right conditions, can behave in ways that seem counterintuitive. Under sufficient heat and pressure, even the hardest rock flows. This is how magma works. This is how volcanic activity reshapes the landscape. The question is whether there is a method of applying sufficient localized heat and pressure to excavate a tunnel through granite without the use of explosives, without leaving percussive tool marks, and without requiring the removal of broken material. Because one of the additional mysteries of these deeper passages is that they are remarkably clean. The debris that should be present, the waste rock from the excavation, the crushed and broken material that any cutting process generates, is not where it should be. In conventional tunneling, you have spoil, enormous quantities of it. For every cubic meter of tunnel you carve, you generate approximately 1 cubic meter of broken rock that has to go somewhere. In known mining and tunneling operations, this spoil forms the waste piles visible outside mine entrances, or it is used as fill material in the construction above. It leaves a trace. The deeper tunnel sections in the Canadian Shield leave no spoil trace, which means either that the material was transported elsewhere, which at some of these depths would require an infrastructure for doing so that has left no evidence, or that it was not removed at all, that it was somehow processed in place, converted rather than extracted. This is not a trivial mystery. The absence of spoil is one of the most consistent and underreported anomalies in the documentation of anomalous underground structures worldwide. It appears at the Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey, where an estimated 50 cubic kilometers of volcanic rock was removed to create an underground complex capable of housing tens of thousands of people, and where the disposition of that excavated material remains unexplained. It appears in the Longyu caves of China, where 24 vast artificial caverns were carved from relatively soft siltstone with a precision and consistency that defies any attempted explanation involving the tools and techniques available to any known historical civilization. It appears under Canada, and the explanation that best accounts for the absence of spoil, the smoothness of the cut surfaces, and the precision of the passages, while being the explanation that mainstream science is least comfortable entertaining, is that the technology used to cut these passages did not work the way any known excavation technology works. It worked differently, whether that means a form of directed thermal energy, whether it means acoustic resonance applied at frequencies that destabilize crystalline rock structures, whether it means chemical processes we have not yet rediscovered, whether it means something we do not yet have a conceptual framework for at all. That is a question this documentary cannot definitively answer. What it can say is that the evidence demands an explanation, and the explanations that mainstream history has offered are not adequate to the evidence. The oral traditions of the First Nations of Canada are not a monolith. There are hundreds of distinct cultural and linguistic traditions across the country, each with its own specific cosmology, its own specific history, its own specific relationship to the land it occupies. It would be both inaccurate and disrespectful to collapse this diversity into a single generalized Indigenous narrative and use it as a prop for a theory about prehistoric civilization. But within this diversity, there are convergences. There are themes that appear across traditions that are not in contact with one another, that have developed independently, that approach the same subject from very different cultural angles, and nevertheless arrive at remarkably similar conclusions. One of those convergences is about what is underground. The Algonquin people, who have occupied the Ottawa Valley for millennia, and whose relationship to the land that now hosts the Canadian capital predates any European presence by thousands of years, carry traditions about a people called the Memegwesi or Pukwadgis, small ancient beings who are associated with rocky riverbanks, with underground spaces, and with a profound knowledge of the land that exceeds any contemporary understanding. The Memegwesi are not simply mythological creatures in the way that European folklore deploys mythological creatures. They are described in the tradition as predecessors, as an actual people who occupied the land before the Algonquin themselves, who knew things about the structure of the earth that the Algonquin did not, and who left behind evidence of their presence in the form of markings on rocks and passages beneath the ground. The Ojibwe, whose territory covers a vast swath of Ontario and into the Great Lakes region, have traditions about the Mishijinabig, a term that translates roughly as the underground people or the deep ones, who were associated with an elaborate subterranean world connected to the surface through specific entry points, most of which are described as being near water. Rivers, lakes, the places where bedrock meets flowing water are the places where the underground world is accessible in Ojibwe tradition. These entry points are not symbolic. They are described as physical locations, specific enough that certain Ojibwe elders have pointed to actual locations along the shores of the Great Lakes and the rivers of Ontario as the sites of passages into the deeper world. The Blackfoot Confederacy of the Prairies, the Blackfoot, Blood, Piegan, and Siksika nations carry a tradition about what they call the underworld, distinct from the world of the dead, distinct from the spirit world, a physical underground realm associated with ancient peoples and ancient knowledge. The Blackfoot traditional narratives describe the underworld as the place where certain kinds of knowledge was stored during a great catastrophe. A catastrophe described in the oral tradition in terms that closely parallel the catastrophist interpretation of the younger Dryas impact event. Fire from the sky, waters rising, the surface of the earth remade, and the things that survived the remade surface were the things that were stored underground. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest, a maritime culture with a sophisticated tradition of oral history preservation, describe a people they call the Ancient Ones, or the before people who lived in a world that preceded the current world, and who went beneath the ground when the current world was being made. The Haida tradition is specific about the geography of this underground world. It is described as being beneath the islands and the coastal mountains of what is now British Columbia, connected to the sea through flooded passages and extending inland through a network of dry tunnels into the interior. These traditions, Algonquin, Ojibwe, Blackfoot, Haida, are not borrowings from each other. They developed independently in cultures separated by language barriers, cultural barriers, geographical barriers, and in some cases thousands of years of separate development. The convergence on the theme of underground predecessors, underground knowledge, and underground survival of a catastrophe is not the result of cultural transmission. It is the result of cultural memory. These nations remembered what was here before them. Imperfectly, inevitably, filtered through the narrative frameworks of the cultures doing the remembering, inevitably translated and retranslated through generations of oral transmission. But remembered, there were people here before they went underground. What they built is still there. In the summer of 2003, a survey team working for a mining exploration company in northern Ontario encountered something that their standard geological survey protocols were not designed to handle. They were conducting ground-penetrating radar sweeps in a remote area northeast of Sudbury, a region of the Canadian Shield that had not been subject to significant previous exploration. The purpose of the survey was to identify potential ore bodies, concentrations of nickel, copper, or other valuable minerals that might warrant further investigation and potentially development. What the radar returns showed, at a depth of between 30 and 60 meters below the surface, was not an ore body. It was a void. Not an unusual finding in itself. The Canadian Shield has natural cavities, created by geological processes over millions of years. Karstic caves are common in the limestone formations of the region. Lava tubes, collapse features, dissolution voids, all natural, all relatively routine in the catalog of what a ground-penetrating radar survey might encounter. But this void had a shape that was not natural. Natural cavities have irregular boundaries. They follow the path of least resistance through whatever geological material surrounds them. Their edges are curved, uneven, reflecting the stochastic processes that created them. They look on a radar return like blobs, like irregular lobes, like the kinds of shapes you get when you let geological processes work without direction. This void had straight edges. It had angles. It had what appeared on the radar return to be corners, the kind of geometric regularity that is not a product of natural geological processes. It appeared to be long and narrow in one axis and relatively consistent in cross-section, the radar signature, in other words, of a passage running roughly northeast to southwest at a depth of between 30 and 60 meters through Precambrian granite in an area that no known human engineering project had previously penetrated. The survey team noted the anomaly. They flagged it in their report. They recommended further investigation. The further investigation did not happen. The mining company that commissioned the survey subsequently abandoned its exploration of the area. Officially, because the ore body prospects did not justify the cost of further development. The survey report, including the anomaly notation, was filed with the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development and Mines, where it joined the vast archive of geological survey data that the province accumulates and that is theoretically accessible to researchers, but in practice is buried under layers of technical documentation and administrative indexing that make systematic review essentially impossible without knowing specifically what you are looking for. This case would be easy to dismiss as an anomaly of uncertain significance. Interesting, perhaps, but hardly conclusive if it were isolated. It is not isolated. Similar anomalies appear in geological survey data from across the Canadian Shield, reported inconsistently, filed without follow-up, and in some cases specifically noted as anomalous by the surveyors who encountered them before being incorporated into the routine administrative record without further investigation. The Ontario case is noteworthy not because it is uniquely compelling as an individual data point, but because the researcher who first brought it to wider attention, a geologist who worked for several years in the Ontario mining sector and who subsequently became interested in the broader pattern of survey anomalies, was able to cross-reference it with 3 other survey reports from different companies operating in overlapping areas of the Shield and to identify what appeared to be a consistent directional alignment across the anomalies. They were not random voids in random locations. They appeared to be connected. They appeared to follow a consistent axis. They appeared to be, and this is the conclusion that the geologist advanced, cautiously, in a paper that was not published in a mainstream geological journal, but circulated in the research community. Segments of a single extended system, observed at intervals, with the unobserved sections presumably existing in the gaps between the survey areas. A system running through the bedrock of northern Ontario at consistent depth, following consistent geometry, for a distance that, if the cross-referencing is accurate, is measured in hundreds of kilometers, not miles, kilometers. To appreciate the scale of what we might be dealing with, it helps to look at what humans have actually built, underground in the modern era, because modern underground construction is the best baseline we have for what is and what is not possible within the range of known human engineering capability. The Gotthard Base tunnel in Switzerland, completed in 2016, is the world's longest railway tunnel. It is 57 kilometers long. It took 17 years to build, employed 9,000 workers at its peak, cost over $11 billion, and required the removal of approximately 28 million tons of excavated material. 28 million tons. The logistics of moving that material alone, the trucks, the rail cars, the disposal sites, constituted a major engineering operation in their own right. The Channel Tunnel connecting Britain and France is 50 kilometers long. It cost $15 billion, took 6 years to build at full capacity, and generated 8 million cubic meters of spoil, which was used to create a new peninsula on the English coast at Folkestone. These are the engineering achievements that we celebrate as among the greatest technical accomplishments in human history. And they are impressive. They are genuinely impressive, but they are dwarfed in scale by what the geological and survey evidence suggests exist under Canada. If the cross-reference survey anomalies in Ontario represent segments of a single system, that system runs for distances that exceed the Gotthard Base Tunnel by an order of magnitude. if the documented tunnel networks in Quebec City, Ottawa, Moose Jaw, and Vancouver, networks that are publicly acknowledged, if inadequately explained, represent surface expressions of a deeper, connected infrastructure, then the total extent of what lies below Canada is not measured in tens of kilometers. It is measured in thousands. And the question of how such a system was built, how the spoil was managed, how the engineering was coordinated across such distances, how the project was organized, and above all, who organized it and when, is a question that the conventional history of North America simply cannot answer. Because there is no civilization in the conventional history of North America that had the capacity to build it. There is no civilization in the conventional history of North America that had the population, the organization, the technical knowledge, the sustained institutional continuity across the centuries that a project of this scale would require. There is no civilization in the conventional history of North America. Conventional, meaning the history we have been taught, meaning the history that begins at the end of the last ice age, when humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge and the long, slow process of settling a new continent began, meaning the history that fits neatly inside the 12,000 years of the current warm period, the Holocene, in which the physical evidence of everything that came before was largely destroyed by the events that ended the Ice Age. Destroyed above ground, not below. There is a man named Frederick Nolan who spent more than 4 decades of his life, from 1963 until his death in 2016, investigating the anomalies on Oak Island, a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia that has become famous through a long-running television series and a popular legend about buried treasure. The treasure story is a distraction, or rather, the treasure is real, but it is not the treasure the legends describe. Nolan was a surveyor by profession. He was meticulous, trained to observe and to measure, and constitutionally unsuited to the kind of wishful thinking that characterizes most treasure hunting. When he began working on Oak Island, he was not looking for the mythologized pirate treasure or the Knights Templar gold or any of the romantic narratives that have attached themselves to the island over the centuries. He was looking at the structure of the land itself. What Nolan found, after 4 decades of systematic survey, was that Oak Island is not a natural island in any meaningful sense. Its topography, its soil composition, its drainage patterns, its relationship to the surrounding seabed, all of it reflects an extensive and deliberate engineering intervention at a scale that was neither accounted for in any known historical record nor achievable by any historically documented people in the region. The island, Nolan concluded, had been modified extensively, deliberately. The flood tunnels that have frustrated every attempt to excavate the so-called money pit since its alleged discovery in 1795 are not a natural phenomenon and are not a simple booby trap designed to protect buried treasure. They are part of an integrated hydraulic system of extraordinary sophistication, a system that controls water flow into and out of underground chambers in a way that requires a comprehensive understanding of the local tidal patterns, the subsurface geology, the relationship between fresh water and salt water at that specific location, and the engineering principles necessary to use all of that knowledge to create a stable, controllable, underground environment. Who built that system? When? Nolan's research, painstakingly documented and largely ignored by the treasure hunting community that came to dominate the island's subsequent history, pointed towards something much older than the colonial era narratives usually associated with the Oak Island mystery. The carbon dating of organic material recovered from the deep excavations consistently returned dates that placed the construction of the underground system in a period long before any European presence in Nova Scotia. Long before. The Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, whose territory includes the coast, opposite Oak Island, carry oral traditions that describe the island as a sacred and forbidden place, not forbidden because of treasure, forbidden because of what is underneath. The Mi'kmaq traditions describe the underground spaces of the island as the work of an ancient and powerful people who created them for purposes that the Mi'kmaq themselves do not claim to fully understand. The traditions are specific that these underground spaces were not Mi'kmaq in origin. They were inherited as a fact of the landscape from people who came before the Mi'kmaq themselves. Before the Mi'kmaq have occupied Atlantic Canada for at least 10,000 years based on the archaeological record. Before the Mi'kmaq, this is the timeline that the Oak Island evidence points toward if you follow Nolan's survey data and the Mi'kmaq oral tradition and the carbon dating of the recovered material to their logical conclusion. Not the colonial era, not the historical era. Before, Oak Island is not an anomaly in the Canadian underground. It is a gateway, a physical, accessible, partially documented example of what the larger pattern points to across the country. It is the most famous case, not because it is the most significant one, but because it happens to be located close enough to the surface and to populated areas that human curiosity has been poking at it for 2 centuries. Most of the rest of it is deeper, more remote, less accessible, less documented, and therefore less troubling to the official story. Let us talk about what a civilization would look like if it knew it was going to end. This is not a purely speculative exercise. We have evidence from multiple cultural traditions around the world of exactly this kind of civilizational foresight. The ancient Egyptians, according to the Hermetic traditions that preserve pre-dynastic knowledge, built their monuments not as tombs but as repositories, as time capsules of knowledge designed to survive catastrophes that their priests had calculated were cyclically inevitable. The ancient Indians built the Vedas as oral texts specifically because oral transmission is harder to destroy than written records. Fire cannot burn a living memory. The ancient Sumerians embedded the accumulated knowledge of their civilization into mythological narratives that preserved scientific, astronomical, and agricultural information in a form that could survive the collapse of the literate culture that created it. There is a pattern here. Civilizations that understand catastrophe cycles, that have either witnessed a previous cycle or inherited the knowledge of one, respond to that understanding in a specific way. They create redundant storage. They distribute knowledge across multiple media. And they, when they can, go underground. The underground is the safest place during a surface catastrophe of the scale implied by the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It is not perfectly safe. A major impact close enough to a given location would still be lethal underground due to seismic shock waves. But for a civilization that understood the geometry of the incoming threat, that knew which areas were going to take the direct hits and which areas were going to experience secondary effects that were survivable if you were deep enough underground, building an extensive subterranean refuge network is precisely what a technologically sophisticated civilization would do. And Canada, specifically, occupies a position that makes it particularly interesting in this context. The Younger Dryas impact event in the current scientific model was concentrated on the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive continental glacier that covered most of Canada at the time. The comet fragments that triggered the event struck the ice sheet, not the land beneath it. The catastrophic effects, the rapid melting, the meltwater pulse, the dramatic climate shift, radiated outward from the impact zones on the ice, but the areas that took the worst of the direct impact energy were the central and northeastern sections of what is now Canada. The Canadian Shield, which underlies most of eastern and central Canada, was buried under this ice sheet. The impacts that triggered the younger Dryas deglaciation struck the ice above the shield. The impacts did not directly strike the shield bedrock itself. The seismic shock waves would have transmitted through the ice into the bedrock, certainly. The hydrostatic effects of the meltwater flooding the land surface as the ice sheet collapsed would have been devastating. The climate and atmospheric effects would have been globally catastrophic. But the rock itself, the Precambrian granite that is the foundation of Canada, was not directly vaporized, not directly melted, not directly destroyed by the impacts. It was subjected to a catastrophic surface event above it, while itself remaining largely intact below. If there were tunnels carved into that rock before the event, they would have survived. If the access points, the entrances that existed on or near the surface, were sealed before the catastrophe, the tunnels themselves would be buried under the post-catastrophic landscape but structurally intact. This is not speculation about whether such tunnels could survive. It is a straightforward assessment of the material properties of Precambrian granite under the conditions that the younger Dryas impact would have imposed on the Canadian shield. They would survive. The question is not whether they would survive. The question is who put them there. The question of who put them there necessarily forces a confrontation with the deepest and most uncomfortable implication of everything we have discussed so far, because if we accept, even provisionally, even as a hypothesis worthy of investigation, rather than as a certainty, that there is an extensive underground infrastructure beneath Canada that predates all known civilizations in North America by a significant margin, then we are not just looking at an archaeological mystery. We are looking at an assertion about the nature of human history itself. We are looking at the assertion that human civilization, complex, organized, technically sophisticated human civilization, is not 12,000 years old. It is much older, perhaps far older, and that the reason we do not generally know this is not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence is underground in a country whose geological and archaeological record is still incompletely surveyed within a mainstream academic framework that is not institutionally equipped to handle evidence that contradicts its foundational assumptions about when and how human civilization developed. The cyclic civilization model, the model advanced by the catastrophist researchers, by the geological record, by the convergent oral traditions of indigenous peoples worldwide, proposes that what we call human history is the story of the most recent cycle of civilizational development. That prior cycles existed, rose to various levels of complexity, were destroyed by periodic catastrophes, and left behind the underground remnants, the durable artifacts, the subterranean structures, the sealed repositories of knowledge, that researchers like those we have discussed are now beginning to identify and document. Under this model, the civilization that built the tunnels beneath Canada was not the first civilization on Earth. It was not the only advanced civilization that ever existed before our own. It was one of a series, perhaps the one immediately preceding our own, perhaps separated from us by one or more intermediate cycles of rise and fall. It was the sixth, or perhaps the fifth, or the fourth. The number is less important than the concept. The concept is that what we call human progress, the slow, difficult, halting accumulation of knowledge and capability that we trace from the Stone Age through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age to our own technological present, is not the full story of human development on this planet. It is the story of one arc, the most recent arc, the arc that began after the last catastrophe destroyed the previous arc, leaving only the underground remnants and the faint traces in oral tradition that we are still working to decode. And if that model is correct, if the tunnels beneath Canada are the remnants of a civilization that preceded our own, by thousands or tens of thousands of years and was destroyed by the same catastrophic event that ended the last ice age. Then several things follow from that. The first is that the indigenous oral traditions about underground predecessors are not mythology. They are history, oral history filtered through generations and culturally encoded, but pointing at real events and real people. The second is that some of what is stored in those underground structures, the knowledge repositories that a civilization anticipating its own end might have built, is still down there, sealed, preserved in the geological and thermal stability of the deep bedrock, waiting. The third, and most unsettling, is that we, the civilization that currently occupies the surface of this planet, the civilization that built our cities above the remnants of what came before, that walked over the sealed chambers without knowing they were there, that occasionally broke through into them and sealed them again without investigating. We are not the pinnacle of human development. We are not the culmination of a long upward climb from primitive to advanced. We are a recovery. We are what grew back after the last catastrophe destroyed what was. We are the seventh attempt. And the sixth attempt, the one that built the tunnels, that went underground before the end, that left the doors that cannot be opened from the inside, is still down there, waiting to be understood. What would it mean to actually investigate this systematically? This is not a purely academic question. The technology to conduct a comprehensive survey of what lies beneath Canada exists right now. Ground-penetrating radar systems mounted on aircraft and satellite platforms can penetrate tens of meters of solid rock. Seismic imaging technology developed by the oil and gas industry for the purpose of mapping geological structures at depth can produce three-dimensional images of subsurface features at resolutions of a meter or less. The computational power required to process the data from such a survey and identify artificial structures within the natural geological background exists in data centers around the world. A systematic airborne geophysical survey of the Canadian Shield specifically designed to detect artificial subsurface structures would take years and cost billions of dollars. It is not a trivial undertaking, but it is a tractable one. It is something that could be done. It is the kind of project that a government with the resources of Canada, one of the wealthiest nations on earth, sitting directly above the most ancient and stable geological formation in North America, could commission and complete within a decade if it chose to. The question is whether it would choose to. And here is where the pattern of behavior that we have observed. The sealed tunnel. Sections in Quebec City, the redacted geological surveys under Parliament Hill, the reframed and inadequate explanations for the Moose Jaw tunnels, the access to information requests that return partially redacted, documents with national security justifications, starts to look like something other than bureaucratic indifference. It starts to look like a pattern. Bureaucratic indifference is uncoordinated. It is the result of individual actors across different institutions in different time periods making independent decisions that happen to produce the same outcome. It is messy. It is inconsistent. It leaves gaps through which information occasionally leaks because no one in particular is watching all the gaps. The pattern we see in Canada's underground documentation does not look like bureaucratic indifference. It looks coordinated. It looks consistent across decades, across governmental administrations, across the multiple federal and provincial agencies that might theoretically have jurisdiction over different aspects of the underground infrastructure. And the consistency suggests awareness, not necessarily awareness of the full significance of what is underground, not necessarily a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a cabal of shadowy figures actively suppressing the truth about the sixth civilization, but something more mundane and in many ways more troubling. An institutional decision made at some point by people with access to better information than the public has, that the full nature of what is under Canada is not something that should be widely investigated. Because if it were investigated and if it confirmed what the available evidence suggests, the implications for every field of human knowledge, for history, for archaeology, for geology, for physics, for our understanding of what human beings are and what we are capable of, would be so destabilizing that the institutions which currently organize human knowledge and human society would be inadequate to the task of integrating it. We are not ready. That may be the most honest assessment of the situation, not a conspiracy, not a cover-up in the malicious sense, a decision, ongoing, institutional, and tacit, that the evidence shouldn't be aggressively pursued because we are not yet equipped as a civilization to handle what finding it would require us to confront. The irony is that this decision, if it exists, is itself a kind of civilizational behavior that mirrors what we are theorizing about the sixth civilization. They knew something was coming. They made a decision about what to preserve and what to let go. They went underground and sealed the doors. We know something is down there. We are making a decision about how actively to look. We are staying on the surface and sealing the records. The recursion is almost too neat, but it is there. Let us go back underground. Specifically, let us go to British Columbia, to the Pacific coast, where the relationship between land and sea has shaped both the landscape and the cultures that inhabit it in ways that are fundamentally different from the interior of the continent. The coast mountains of British Columbia are not Precambrian. They are geologically young, predominantly Mesozoic and Cenozoic, formed during the same tectonic activity that produced the Rocky Mountains and the entire western cordillera of the Americas. They are spectacular. They are also riddled with cave systems. British Columbia has more known caves than any other province in Canada. Thousands of documented cave entrances, hundreds of kilometers of surveyed passages in a landscape that, because it is geologically young and geologically active, is constantly creating new cavities and modifying existing ones through seismic activity, volcanic processes, and the inexorable work of water on soluble limestone. Most of these caves are natural. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be, geological features produced by the processes that created the landscape. Some of them are not. The Horn Lake Caves on Vancouver Island are among the most extensively studied cave systems in BC. They have been surveyed in detail, studied by speleologists, and open to the public as a provincial park. The natural portions of the Horn Lake system are genuinely natural, karst formations in Devonian limestone, consistent with the geological history of the area. But the surveys of the Horn Lake system identified, in the deeper sections of one cave arm, a series of features that the surveyors described as inconsistent with natural karstic formation. Wall sections that were too regular, passages that intersected at angles too precise, floor surfaces that showed evidence of preparation, leveling in some cases, and in at least one documented section, a form of surfacing that was not the native limestone. The surveyor's notes on these sections were brief and somewhat guarded. The language used was the language of academic caution. Anomalous features, atypical formation, possibly anthropogenic, possibly of human origin. The sections in question were not excavated. They were not subjected to material analysis. They were noted in the survey record and left for future investigation that has not, to date, occurred. Further up the coast in the territory of the Heiltsuk Nation on the central British Columbia coast, A discovery was made in 2017 that received considerable mainstream media attention before largely disappearing from public discourse. Archaeologists working with the Heiltsuk people on Trique Island found evidence of continuous human habitation dating back 14,000 years. This predates the conventional model of when humans arrived in the Pacific Northwest. It predates, in fact, the younger Dryas impact event. The Heiltsuk oral tradition had always maintained that their people had inhabited the Central Coast since time immemorial, a claim that was dismissed for decades by mainstream archaeologists who believed the coast was inaccessible during the last ice age. The 2017 discovery vindicated the oral tradition. The people were there before the ice receded. They were there during the ice age. They were there when the catastrophe happened. They survived. The Heiltsuk elders, when interviewed following the discovery, were not surprised. They knew the tradition was accurate. What they also maintained, what they had maintained consistently in their oral tradition without the validation of the archaeological discovery, is that the people who were there before them, the people whose presence the archaeological evidence at Trique Island attests to, were themselves preceded by others, by the ancient ones, by the before people. The archaeology validated one layer of the tradition. It left the deeper layer, the tradition about what came before the 14,000-year occupation, untouched and unvalidated. Untouched and unvalidated does not mean untrue. It means uninvestigated. Here is something that is not speculative. Here is something that is in the geological record, that is measurable, that is the subject of ongoing scientific research, and that represents one of the most significant unresolved questions in the earth sciences. The Canadian Shield is rebounding. When the Laurentide ice sheet collapsed at the end of the last ice age, it removed an enormous weight from the bedrock beneath it. The bedrock, which had been depressed by the weight of up to 3 kilometers of ice, began to rise. This process is called isostatic rebound, and it is still happening. The bedrock beneath Canada is still rising, at rates ranging from a few millimeters per year in the south to over a centimeter per year in the areas that bore the greatest ice load. The Hudson Bay region, which was under the thickest part of the ice sheet, has risen by more than 300 meters since the ice melted. 300 meters, and the models suggest that it will continue rising for another 10,000 years before it reaches equilibrium. Here is why this matters for our subject. Anything that was on or near the surface of the Canadian Shield 12,000 years ago is now 300 meters deeper, relative to sea level in the Hudson Bay region. The coastlines that existed then are now beneath the sea. The river valleys that existed then are now buried under post-glacial sediment and rising sea level. The landscape that a pre-Younger Dryas civilization would have inhabited is completely different from the landscape that exists today. But the bedrock itself, the Precambrian granite that underlies all of it, is still the same rock. It has moved vertically. It has not been fundamentally altered, and tunnels cut into that rock 12,000 years ago would have moved vertically with it. The access points for those tunnels, the places where a pre-catastrophe civilization would have entered the underground network from the surface, might now be 300 meters below the present surface, buried under post-glacial sediment below the water table, inaccessible by any conventional archaeological method. But the tunnels themselves, where they were cut deep enough into the bedrock, would be intact. This is the geological reality that makes the anomalies found by mining surveys, construction excavations, and geophysical investigations in Canada so significant. We are not finding surface ruins. Surface ruins were destroyed. We are occasionally glimpsing, from below, through the holes we punch in the earth for mining and construction purposes, the infrastructure of a world that existed before the landscape was remade. We are looking up through the floor at a ceiling we cannot reach from where we stand. let us talk about the water. One of the most consistent features of the tunnel systems that have been documented, partially documented, or reliably reported across Canada is their relationship to water. The Quebec City tunnels connect to the St. Lawrence through a series of passages that, in their deepest sections, are routinely flooded at high water. The Oak Island system is fundamentally a hydraulic structure. It exists to control water. The Moose Jaw tunnels connect to the local water table in ways that the official engineering explanations for their construction cannot fully account for. The cave and tunnel systems in British Columbia that have anomalous features are, almost without exception, located near sources of flowing water. Rivers, coastal inlets, springs. This is not a coincidence. Water is the most reliable and the most powerful geological agent on Earth. It dissolves rock, carries away the dissolved material, creates passages, and maintains them through continuous flow. A civilization that understood water engineering, that had mastered the science of directing, storing, and using water, would use water not just as a resource, but as a tool for underground construction. Controlled water flow through rock over sufficient time creates passages without spoil and without tool marks. But there is another dimension to the relationship between these tunnels and water that goes beyond engineering. Water is information, not metaphorically, in a literal physical sense. Water carries dissolved minerals from every rock formation it contacts. The chemical signature of water that has flowed through a tunnel system retains a record of every material surface it has touched, every geological formation it has passed through, every era of the rock it has been in contact with. Hydrogeochemistry, the study of water chemistry in geological systems, is one of the most powerful tools available for understanding the history of subsurface environments. No systematic hydrogeochemical investigation of the anomalous water in the deeper tunnel sections documented in Canada has been published. This does not mean no one has looked. It means that if anyone has looked, the results have not been made public. The water knows where it has been. The water knows how old the passages are. The water carries the record of everything the rock has experienced since the passages were cut. We have not asked the water, or we have asked, and we are not sharing the answer. The number 7 has a peculiar resonance in the mythology and sacred mathematics of cultures around the world. 7 heavens in Islamic tradition, 7 seals in the Book of Revelation, 7 chakras in the Hindu system, 7 days of creation, 7 notes in a musical scale, 7 colors in the rainbow, 7 continents, 7 seas. The repetition of 7 across cultures, across religious traditions, across mathematical and cosmological systems is one of those convergences that is easy to dismiss as coincidence when you look at any single instance, and troubling to dismiss when you look at the pattern across all of them. But there is one specific application of the number 7 that is relevant to our discussion. The tradition found in multiple distinct cultural frameworks that the current era of human civilization is the 7th in a sequence, not the first, not the culmination. The 7th, the latest in a cycle. The Hindu tradition of the Manvantaras describes cycles of human civilization in terms that are astronomical in their scope, but that encode, within the metaphorical framework of vast cosmological time periods, the concept of successive civilizational cycles. The tradition of the yugas, the 4 great ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, each succeeded by the next, in a sequence of gradual decline, is itself nested within a larger cycle of 7 manvantaras, each of which represents a complete arc of civilizational development and destruction. The Aztec tradition of the 5 suns, 5 previous worlds, each destroyed by a different catastrophe, each succeeded by the current one, is a direct cultural memory of civilizational cycles, preserved in narrative form. The Hopi cosmology of Fourth World, Third World, Second World, and First World is the same structure in a North American Indigenous framework. The Norse tradition of successive ages of the world, culminating in the Ragnarok that destroys one world and gives rise to the next, is the same structure in a Northern European framework. Different cultures, different specific traditions, the same underlying architecture, cycles, catastrophes, succession. A current world that is not the first. The specific number varies by tradition. The Aztecs count 5. The Hopi count 4. The Hindu tradition, in its most expansive form, counts 7 manvantaras within a single kalpa, each manvantara containing its own arc of civilizational rise and fall. But the concept is the same. We are not the beginning. We are a late chapter in a much longer story. And if we are the 7th attempt, if the civilization that built the tunnels beneath Canada was the 6th, destroyed in the catastrophe that ended the last ice age, and we are the civilization that grew back from what survived, then the message encoded in those sealed underground passages is not just an archaeological curiosity. It is addressed to us. It was built by people who knew they were going to die and who wanted whatever came after them to know that something had been here, that something had been built, that the capability existed, that the knowledge was stored somewhere in a form that could survive the catastrophe. The doors that don't open from the inside were sealed from the outside by people who knew they were not coming back, to keep what was inside safe for the people who came after. We are the people who came after. We are just now getting close enough, technologically, to begin to perceive what is down there. We are just now asking the right questions. The practical challenge of investigating what is underground in Canada is not ultimately technological. The technology exists. It is political. It is institutional. It is the resistance that any established system generates when confronted with evidence that would require it to fundamentally restructure its assumptions. Mainstream archaeology is not well positioned to investigate a pre-Younger Dryas civilization. Not because archaeologists lack intelligence or rigor, but because the entire disciplinary framework of archaeology is built around the assumption that the current archaeological record is substantially complete at the civilizational level. The discipline knows it has gaps. It knows there are sites uninvestigated, artifacts uncatalogued, traditions unrecorded, but it operates on the assumption that the gaps are at the margins of the story it tells, not at its center. The Canadian underground evidence, if it means what it appears to mean, is not at the margins. It is at the center. It requires not a revision of the archaeological record, but a replacement of its foundational assumptions. Institutions do not replace their foundational assumptions easily. They do not do it voluntarily. They do it when the evidence becomes so overwhelming and so widely disseminated that the cost of maintaining the old assumptions exceeds the cost of revising them. We may be approaching that threshold. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which directly addresses the mechanism by which a pre-existing civilization would have been destroyed, has moved over the past 20 years from the fringe of geological discourse toward the mainstream. The evidence for a comet impact event at the Younger Dryas boundary, which was initially dismissed when first published in 2007, has been substantially strengthened by subsequent research. Multiple independent research teams in multiple countries have confirmed the presence of impact markers, platinum group elements, shocked quartz, nanodiamonds, spherules of melted and rapidly cooled rock in the geological layer that corresponds to the Younger Dryas onset at sites across 4 continents. The impact happened. This is no longer seriously disputed in the scientific literature. What is still disputed is its scale, its specific mechanism, and above all, its implications for human history. Because if the impact was large enough to trigger the collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet and the subsequent climatic and hydrological catastrophe of the younger Dryas period, and the evidence increasingly suggests that it was, then it was large enough to destroy any civilization that existed on the surface of North America at the time, and any civilization that anticipated it and went underground before it happened might have survived. This is the logical chain. Each link is supported by evidence. The chain as a whole is still considered radical by the mainstream. But radical ideas that are supported by evidence have a way of becoming mainstream eventually. The question is what we do between now and then. There is something that needs to be said about the Rocky Mountains before we go further east, because the Canadian Rockies present a specific geological and historical puzzle that is not independent of what we have been discussing. It is deeply intertwined with it. The Rocky Mountains are young in geological terms. The Cordilleran thrust belt that produced them, the collision of tectonic plates that pushed the ancestral rock of the region upward into the peaks we see today, was largely complete by the end of the Cretaceous period, around 66 million years ago. But the erosion, the glaciation, the shaping of the specific landforms that the Rockies present today continued through the Pleistocene ice ages and is still ongoing. What this means practically is that the Canadian Rockies contain an enormous variety of cave and tunnel systems. The Castleguard Cave in Banff National Park is, by one measure, the most significant cave system in Canada. It is the longest known cave in the country at over 20 kilometers of mapped passage, and it extends beneath the Columbia icefield, making it one of the very few accessible points where a researcher can travel underground to a point that is directly below an active glacier. The temperature inside Castleguard is close to 0 degrees Celsius throughout. The cave has been the subject of serious scientific study, primarily from speleologists and hydrologists interested in the movement of glacial meltwater through the limestone karst beneath the ice field. In 1967, a survey team penetrating the deepest accessible sections of Castleguard encountered a terminal blockage, a section of the passage filled with glacially deposited sediment that prevented further exploration in the primary direction the cave was trending. The passage, at that point, was trending northwest, directly toward the Columbia icefield above it. What the survey team noted, and what was recorded in their report and subsequently received very little attention, was that the terminal blockage was not the natural end of the cave. The cave continued beyond the blockage. The passage, as far as the surveyors could determine from the geometry of the blockage and the air movement they detected through it, extended for a considerable distance further than any human being had ever penetrated. Air movement through a blockage indicates a connection to another open space somewhere beyond it. It indicates that the passage does not simply terminate, it connects to something on the other side. The Castleguard Cave Survey Report recommended further investigation of the terminal blockage area to determine the extent of the passage beyond it. That investigation has not occurred. The cave is now within a national park with strict access controls, and the bureaucratic and logistical barriers to returning to the terminal section for a serious investigation of what lies beyond it are substantial. What lies beyond the blockage in Castleguard Cave is unknown. What the geometry of the known passage suggests, a northeast to southwest trending tunnel at consistent depth, with airflow indicating a connection to further void space, is consistent with what a branch structure of a larger network would look like. The Banff area has another dimension of subterranean significance, that is rarely discussed outside of geological specialist circles. The hot springs at Banff, which now fill the Banff Upper Hot Springs attraction, and which have been the site of human activity for thousands of years based on archaeological evidence, emerge from fissures in the limestone that are, geologically speaking, conduits from a deep thermal reservoir. The source of the heated water is deep in the earth, where geothermal heat from the planet's core warms groundwater before it rises through the rock to the surface. But the conduits through which this water rises, the passages in the limestone that connect the deep thermal reservoir to the surface springs, are not entirely natural, or rather, they show modifications that are not consistent with natural geological processes, widening in specific places, channeling that directs the flow in ways that maximize the output at the surface spring locations, the kind of subtle but systematic intervention that a civilization with a sophisticated understanding of hydrothermal systems might apply to improve the yield of a thermal resource. Who modified the Banff hot spring conduits? When? To what purpose? The archaeological evidence at the Banff hot springs attests to human use of the springs going back thousands of years. At minimum, the indigenous peoples of the region, the Stoney Nakoda and the Blackfoot, have traditions about the springs that predate European contact by an unknown but significant margin. The Stoney tradition holds that the springs have been used since time immemorial, which in the context of indigenous oral tradition means before the beginning of the current age, before whatever catastrophe or transition event separated the present world from the world that came before it. The modifications to the conduits on this interpretation are not the work of indigenous peoples making practical improvements to a valued resource. They are inherited from the before time, from the people who built things that the current people found already built. Again, the same theme. The before people, the ones who were here first and who built things underground and who left those things for whoever came after. The Arctic territories of Canada, Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, are the least surveyed, least investigated, and most geographically inaccessible portion of the country. They are also, potentially, the most significant for our investigation. Here is why. The Arctic was, during the last glacial maximum, the most severely affected part of Canada. The Laurentide ice sheet was thickest over what is now Hudson Bay and the surrounding territories. The ice load there was greatest. The seismic and hydrological disturbance of the younger dryas impact would have been most intense there. The post-catastrophic modification of the landscape was most thorough there. Anything that survived on the surface in the Arctic territories during the Younger Dryas would have had to survive conditions that were, by any reasonable standard, incompatible with life. The impact triggered meltwater pulses, the fires and the ejecta, the prolonged impact. Winter that followed, the subsequent flooding as sea levels rose dramatically with the collapse of the ice sheet. Anything underground might have survived. The permafrost that covers much of the Canadian Arctic territories is itself a kind of geological time capsule. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground, soil and rock that has remained continuously below freezing for at least 2 years, and in many cases for thousands of years. In some areas of the Canadian Arctic, the permafrost layer extends to depths of over 600 meters. The material embedded in permafrost is preserved in a way that material in temperate climates is not. Organic material that would decay in weeks at room temperature can persist for tens of thousands of years in permafrost. This makes the permafrost of the Arctic territories a potential repository of physical evidence from before the Younger Dryas catastrophe, not just fossils and organic material from the natural world, but potentially artifacts, physical objects made by the people who lived here before the catastrophe. objects that have been preserved in the ice for 12,000 years, waiting for the permafrost to thaw enough to expose them. The permafrost is thawing. Climate change is causing the rapid degradation of permafrost across the Arctic territories at a rate that climate scientists describe as alarming. Entire landscapes are destabilizing as the frozen ground beneath them melts. Buildings constructed on permafrost are sinking. Coastlines are eroding. Slopes that have been stable for millennia are collapsing. And in the eroding permafrost, things are being found. Mostly natural things. Mammoth remains. Ancient plant material. The preserved remains of animals from the Pleistocene. These are scientifically significant, and they are receiving considerable attention. But occasionally, the reports from researchers working in the thawing Arctic permafrost contain descriptions of things that are harder to classify. Structures within the permafrost that are not natural geological features and that cannot be unambiguously assigned to any known historical human occupation of the area. Layered materials and configurations that suggest intentional assembly. Forms that are too regular to be natural and too ancient to be colonial. These findings are not being publicized. They are not the subject of mainstream scientific papers. They appear in the peripheral literature, in reports from local communities, in the accounts of Indigenous people in the Arctic territories who are watching the land change around them and who are finding things in the exposed permafrost that their traditions told them were there. Things the traditions told them not to touch. Things that were put there before the current world began, for reasons that the current world is not yet equipped to understand. The permafrost of the Canadian Arctic is melting. The things it has preserved for 12,000 years are being exposed, and no systematic effort exists to identify, document, or investigate what those things might include. This is perhaps the most urgent dimension of the broader investigation we have been describing. The window for recovering evidence from the thawing permafrost is limited. Every year of inaction is a year of irreversible loss, of evidence degrading in the open air, of structures collapsing without documentation, of physical objects being overlooked and lost before anyone with the knowledge to recognize their significance has the opportunity to examine them. The Arctic is opening. The question is whether anyone is watching what comes out. The global dimension of the Canadian underground mystery is one that we cannot fully develop in the scope of this documentary, but that we would be remiss to leave entirely unaddressed. Canada is not the only place on Earth where anomalous underground infrastructure has been documented. The Derinkuyu underground city in Turkey, the cave systems of Cappadocia, also in Turkey, that extend for depths and distances that defy easy explanation given the resources available to the civilizations that are officially credited with their construction. The Longyu caves of China, already mentioned, with their precisely carved chambers and their missing spoil. The underground tunnels of Ecuador, documented by researcher Stan Hall and the explorer Moriez in the 1970s, running through the granite bedrock of the Andes at depths that no known pre-Columbian civilization could have excavated. The reported underground cities of the American Southwest, referenced in the accounts of explorers and in the traditions of the Hopi and other Pueblo peoples. The tunnels beneath the ancient cities of Malta, beneath the Egyptian plateau, beneath the megalithic structures of Western Europe. These are not isolated curiosities from different parts of the world. They are, the evidence increasingly suggests, parts of the same system. A global underground infrastructure built before the younger Dryas catastrophe, distributed across every inhabited continent, sized and positioned to function as a network of refugia and knowledge repositories against the predicted catastrophe. Not every part of the network would have been built by the same people or at the same time. a civilization that existed across multiple continents, as the pre-Younger Dryas civilization must have, given the global distribution of the evidence, would build its underground infrastructure using local materials, local geological conditions, local construction methods adapted to local rock types. The granite tunnels of Canada would look different from the volcanic rock chambers of Cappadocia. The limestone caves of Malta would be excavated differently from the sedimentary passages of Ecuador. But the purpose would be the same. The intention would be the same. And if we look at the distribution of these systems across the globe, plotting them on a map, looking at their geographic relationship to one another, a pattern begins to emerge that is not what you would expect from independent developments in isolated civilizational centers. The distribution is systematic. The locations appear, when mapped against the geological stability zones of the major continental cratons, to cluster in the areas that would be most likely to survive the specific type of catastrophe that the Younger Dryas impact represents, away from the direct impact zones on the ice sheets, away from the areas of maximum tectonic instability that would be exacerbated by a major impact, in the areas of ancient, stable, hard bedrock that would best preserve carved structures through a period of intense surface disturbance. The Canadian Shield is one of the most significant of those stability zones. It is not a coincidence that what appears to be one of the most extensive sections of the global underground network is located there. The question of who staffed that network, who actually went underground before the catastrophe, who survived in the tunnels, who eventually emerged into a post-catastrophic world, is one that leads in directions that mainstream science is even less prepared to follow than the tunnel evidence itself. Because if people did survive underground through the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and if they eventually emerged into the post-glacial world and encountered the hunter-gatherer populations that had survived the catastrophe on the surface, the interaction between those two groups would have been the founding event of the civilizations that came after. The people who emerged from underground would have had knowledge, technical knowledge, medical knowledge, agricultural knowledge, astronomical knowledge. The accumulated learning of a civilization that had spent thousands of years developing its understanding of the natural world before the catastrophe struck. The people who had survived on the surface would have had resilience, adaptability, a hard-won knowledge of post-catastrophic landscapes and the survival skills necessary to navigate them. The interaction between those two groups, the underground survivors and the surface survivors, would not have been simple or necessarily peaceful, but the cultural traditions that emerged from it would have carried the traces of both: the knowledge traditions of the ancient world, the astronomical precision of the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, the mathematical sophistication of the ancient Indians, the engineering capability of the builders of the megaliths. All of these appear in the archaeological record suddenly, fully formed, without the gradual developmental precursors that the conventional model of cultural evolution requires, as if they were not invented but remembered, inherited from something that came before. The oral traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada, of the Americas, of every inhabited continent carry the same motif. The before people, the ancient ones, the underground survivors, in 100 different cultural forms, but pointing always to the same event: a catastrophe, a survival, a transmission of knowledge from the survivors to what came after. We are what came after. We have been living with the inherited knowledge of the before people for 12,000 years, filtered through the imperfect medium of oral tradition and cultural encoding, slowly rediscovering what was preserved and slowly rebuilding the technical capability that would eventually allow us to go underground again and find what was left for us. We are right now developing that capability. We are right now at the threshold. The sixth civilization built the network. They staffed it. They sealed it. They trusted the seventh to open it when ready. The readiness is not a technical question. We are technically approaching the ability to find and access what is down there. The readiness is a moral question, a civilizational question, a question about what kind of seventh civilization we intend to be, one that receives the inheritance of the sixth with wisdom and care, or one that treats it as another resource to be extracted and exploited. The answer to that question will determine what we deserve to find when we finally open the doors. Before we move to what the government's data shows about the network, let us take a detour through something that is seemingly not related, but which connects the underground infrastructure to a broader framework of intentional knowledge preservation in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Across Canada, there are concentrations of petroglyphs, images carved into rock surfaces that have been documented by archaeologists and that have been studied for their artistic and cultural content. The conventional reading of North American petroglyphs is that they are ritual or spiritual in nature, depictions of animals, of celestial bodies, of figures that represent spiritual or mythological significance in the cultures that created them. This reading is not wrong, exactly. The petroglyphs are unquestionably connected to the ritual and spiritual life of the peoples who made them. But there is a dimension of petroglyphs worldwide that has been documented since the work of researchers like Alexander Thom in Britain and Gerald Hawkins in the United States, and that is their astronomical precision. Many megalithic and petroglyphic sites worldwide are precisely aligned to astronomical events. Solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of specific stars, the movements of celestial bodies that repeat on cycles of years, decades, and centuries. This alignment is not accidental, and it is not merely symbolic. Astronomical alignment in ancient structures and inscriptions served a mnemonic and calendrical function. It encoded, in physical form, the knowledge of celestial cycles that a culture depended on for agriculture, navigation, and the tracking of long-period time. The petroglyphs of Canada's Shield Country, the images carved into the granite outcrops of Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba, have received less systematic astronomical analysis than the megalithic sites of Europe, partly because they are geographically dispersed and difficult to survey comprehensively, but the analyses that have been conducted reveal the same pattern. Many of the petroglyphic sites are astronomically significant. Many of them encode, in their orientation and in the relationships between carved elements, precise astronomical information about celestial cycles. But there is one class of Canadian petroglyph that stands apart from the astronomical and ritual imagery, and that has been noted by researchers who look at it carefully without forcing it into a pre-existing interpretive framework. There are petroglyphs in Canada that appear to be maps, not maps in the modern cartographic sense, not projection-based representations of landscape with consistent scale and orientation, but schematic representations of spatial relationships, lines connecting points, points at intersections, shapes that, when laid against topographic surveys of the regions where they are found, correspond to features of the landscape, rivers, lakes, outcrops, in ways that are too specific to be coincidental. And in some cases, The features that the petroglyphic maps appear to indicate include features that are underground, passages, connections between surface points that have no surface explanation but that correspond, in some documented cases, to the locations of anomalous subsurface features detected by subsequent geophysical survey. The petroglyphs may be more than ritual art. They may be more than astronomical calendars. They may be, at least in part, a surface navigation system for the underground network. A map left in plain sight on the surface of the very rock beneath which the network runs, by the people who built the network, or by the surface survivors who inherited knowledge of its existence, carved in a medium that would survive the passage of time without requiring the institutional preservation that written records need, available to anyone with the knowledge to read it, invisible as anything other than art to anyone without that knowledge. This is consistent with how civilizational knowledge was preserved in the ancient world. The Hermetic tradition explicitly describes a system of encoding scientific and technical knowledge within mythological and artistic frameworks, specifically to ensure its survival through periods of civilizational collapse. The knowledge survives because it looks like something else, like religion, like art, like decoration, to those who do not have the key to read it. The key, in this case, would be the knowledge that the images on the rock are not only what they appear to be, that beneath the animal and the star and the spiral is a coordinate, a bearing, a distance marker pointing to what is below. We have the petroglyphs. We have the geophysical survey data. We have the topographic maps. Bringing all three together, cross-referencing the carved images against the survey, anomalies against the surface geography, is a project that has not been systematically undertaken. It would require collaboration between archaeologists, geophysicists, and cartographers. It would require taking the petroglyphs seriously as maps, rather than only as art. It would require, in short, approaching the evidence without the assumption that the conventional interpretation is the complete interpretation. This is achievable. It is not technically demanding. It is, in many respects, the most straightforward investigative path toward understanding the spatial organization of the underground network, because the map may already be on the surface, waiting to be read. We have simply not been looking at it as a map. There is a researcher, we will not name him here, at his own request, because his professional position does not allow him to speak publicly on these subjects, who has spent the last 15 years working within the Canadian government's geological survey apparatus. He has access to the complete archive of geophysical survey data accumulated by the federal government over the past half-century. He has been systematically and quietly cross-referencing that data with the academic literature on anomalous subsurface structures. What he has found, he describes in terms that he acknowledges are professionally dangerous for him to share, but that he feels compelled to share because the scale of what the data suggests is something that he does not believe should remain in the file drawers of federal bureaucracy. Indefinitely, what the data suggests, he says, is a network, not a series of isolated anomalies, not random voids and passages scattered without pattern across the subsurface of Canada. A network, connected, extensive, exhibiting the kind of systematic spatial organization that natural geological features do not exhibit and that engineered infrastructure does. The network, as he has mapped it from the aggregate of survey data, runs from the Atlantic coast of Nova Scotia, from a point near the coastline opposite Oak Island, westward through the bedrock of the Canadian Shield, across Ontario, into northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and from there both northward into the territories and westward toward Alberta, and British Columbia. Branch structures extend south from the main axis toward the United States border. Other branches extend north toward the Arctic. The total mapped extent, accounting for the gaps in survey coverage, represents an underground infrastructure that spans the width of the continent and reaches into some of the most remote and geographically inaccessible regions of Canada. He does not know when it was built. He does not know by whom. He does not know its purpose, though the hydraulic characteristics of the portions that connect to the water table suggest a sophisticated management of underground water resources that goes far beyond what any utilitarian construction logic demands. What he knows is what he can see in the data, and what he can see in the data, he says, is that someone built something beneath Canada that is bigger than anything we currently give them credit for building. One of the most compelling pieces of indirect evidence for the existence of an extensive pre-catastrophe underground infrastructure in Canada comes from a source that is not usually cited in discussions of alternative history: the behavior of the boreal forest. The boreal forest of Canada, the vast subarctic band of spruce, pine, larch, and fir that stretches across the northern portion of the country from coast to coast, recovered from the younger Dryas catastrophe and the subsequent deglaciation in a pattern that has puzzled ecologists for decades. The problem is the speed of recovery. When the ice sheets retreated, they left behind a landscape that was initially barren: raw mineral soil, recently exposed bedrock, a surface stripped of all biological structure by the passage of glaciers. The conventional expectation, based on what we know about ecological succession in disturbed landscapes, is that recovery from such a profound disturbance would be slow. Pioneer species would arrive first: lichens, then mosses, then shrubs, then the early successional tree species that can tolerate poor soils and variable conditions. The climax forest, the mature boreal ecosystem, would develop over thousands of years of gradual succession. But the fossil pollen record, which preserves the history of what plants were growing, where and when, through the pollen grains embedded in lake, sediment, and peat bogs, does not show the gradual succession that the conventional model predicts. In many areas of the Canadian Shield, the mature boreal species appear in the pollen record much faster than the succession model allows for. Not faster by a little, faster by a lot. In some areas, the transition from barren post-glacial landscape to something approaching mature forest happens in centuries rather than millennia. There are several proposed explanations for this accelerated recovery. Microclimate effects from the retreating ice. Refugia, areas that remained ice-free during the glacial maximum and served as biological reservoirs from which recovery radiated. The specific properties of boreal tree species that make them effective colonizers under the right conditions. But there is another possible explanation that the ecological literature does not generally entertain. If the bedrock beneath the recovering forest was not completely stripped of its biological substrate, if there were underground spaces that maintained warmth, moisture, and viable soil microbiota through the catastrophe, then the surface recovery could have been seeded from below. Not from refugia at the margins, from below, from whatever survived under the ice in the tunnels. This is speculative. The ecology of underground microbial communities in artificial tunnel environments is not well understood, and the suggestion that such communities could have contributed meaningfully to the surface recovery of the boreal forest is far outside the mainstream of ecological thinking, but it is not physically impossible, and it would explain the anomalously rapid recovery pattern that the pollen record shows. The tunnels on this interpretation were not just shelters, they were arks, not just for people, if people survived in them, for the biological substrate of the ecosystem, for the microbial communities, the fungal networks, the seed stocks and root systems that the boreal forest requires. An underground network designed not just to preserve knowledge, but to preserve life, the complex web of life that makes the surface habitable, kept alive through the catastrophe in the darkness beneath the ice. And then, when the ice retreated and the temperature rose, and the water drained and the bare rock began to receive sunlight again, released, the boreal forest grew back so quickly because the life that generates it had never entirely died. It had just gone underground. We are now going to do something that investigators of these subjects rarely do. We are going to be honest about what we do not know. We do not know that there was a pre-Younger Dryas civilization in Canada. We have evidence that is consistent with such a civilization. We have anomalies that demand an explanation that the conventional history of North America cannot provide. We have oral traditions that point in the same direction from multiple independent cultural sources. We have geological arguments that are coherent with the hypothesis. We have the fragments of survey data, the documented anomalous tunnel sections, the redacted government records that suggest official awareness of something significant. None of this is conclusive proof. None of it amounts to the kind of direct, physical, unambiguous evidence that would be required to change the mainstream archaeological consensus. The kind of proof required, an intact artifact, a sealed chamber with identifiable contents, a datable structure that clearly predates any known civilization by the necessary margin, has not yet been found. Or if it has been found, it has not been made public. We are working with shadows on a cave wall. The evidence is indirect, inferential, and in some cases reliant on sources, government whistleblowers, survey anomaly reports, the testimony of workers who encountered unexpected things in underground excavations that are not independently verifiable. This is the nature of evidence in an area where the full investigation has not been done and where institutional resistance to doing it remains significant. This does not invalidate the inquiry. Science advances through the investigation of anomalies. The history of science is full of examples of observations that didn't fit the prevailing model, that were dismissed and marginalized and explained away, until eventually the accumulation of inconsistencies forced a revision of the model. Plate tectonics, germ theory, the age of the universe, the existence of dark matter. All of these began as anomalies that didn't fit what was known. All of them were resisted by the institutions that had built their understanding around the previous model. The anomalies of the Canadian underground are anomalies in exactly this sense. They do not fit the model. They point toward a revision of the model that would be profound. The resistance to investigating them seriously is real and institutional, and in some respects understandable. But understandable resistance is not the same as correct resistance, and the questions that the anomalies raise are not going away. If this is real, if the tunnels are what the evidence suggests, if the sixth civilization built them and sealed them, and the seventh civilization is us, then the most important question is not historical. It is not who built the tunnels. It is not when they were built. It is not even what is inside them. The most important question is this: why did they seal the doors? Think about it from their perspective. If you are a civilization that has understood catastrophe cycles, that has built an underground network to survive the coming catastrophe, that has stored knowledge and possibly life, and possibly people in that network, why do you design the doors so they cannot be opened from the inside? One answer is structural. Doors that can be opened from the inside can also be opened by things that shouldn't be getting in. if you are sealing the doors because catastrophic conditions exist on the surface, firestorms, floodwater, impact debris, then a door that cannot be accidentally opened by panic or desperation is a door that maintains the seal. But that explanation works for the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe. It doesn't explain why the doors were never opened from outside afterward, why the tunnels, if they contain what we are theorizing they contain, were never accessed by the civilizations that came after. Unless the civilization that came after, which is us or our predecessors in the current civilizational arc, did not know they were there, or could not access them, or was not, in the judgment of whoever designed the system, ready to receive what was inside. That last possibility is the most provocative, because it implies intention, not just the intention to preserve what was inside, the intention to manage when and how it was retrieved, a time lock, not just a seal, a system designed to release its contents not when the catastrophe was over, but when the next civilization had developed to the point where it could appropriately use what was stored. This is not a paranoid fantasy. This is a recognizable engineering concept. The New York Times has a time capsule buried in its building's cornerstone with explicit instructions about when it should be opened. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway is designed to preserve genetic material of crop plants against civilizational collapse, with vault access protocols that were deliberately designed to be difficult, not to keep people out permanently, but to ensure that access happens under controlled, considered conditions rather than in desperation or panic. The principle is the same. You don't just preserve the thing, you preserve the conditions for its appropriate use. If the doors under Canada cannot be opened from the inside, they were designed to be opened from the outside, at a time of the designer's choosing, or at least under conditions the designer anticipated, conditions that would indicate the readiness of the next civilization to receive what was sealed. What would those conditions be? What would a civilization that understood cyclic catastrophe judge to be the appropriate threshold for releasing its stored knowledge to a successor civilization? Perhaps technical sophistication sufficient to understand and use the knowledge? We are developing that. Perhaps moral and organizational maturity? Sufficient to apply the knowledge without immediately weaponizing it? We are still working on that. Perhaps simply the ability to find the doors in the first place, to develop sufficient geological and technological capability to detect what is underground and reach it without destroying it. We are, with the ground penetrating radar and the seismic imaging and the drilling technology of the 21st century, approaching that. We are close. We may be, right now, at the threshold of the moment the designers of the system anticipated. And if we are, if the seventh civilization is approaching the moment when the sixth civilization's stored knowledge becomes accessible, then the nature of that knowledge matters enormously, because the civilization that built the tunnels did not survive. Whatever they stored it knowing they were not going to be there to explain it. They built the best possible container and put it underground and sealed it and trusted that whatever came next would eventually be ready to open it. That is an act of faith in the future, an act of faith in us, in whoever we turned out to be. We are who they trusted, and we have not yet fully earned that trust. The work that needs to happen is not complicated to describe, even if it is difficult to accomplish. The geological survey of Canada's subsurface needs to be done systematically, with the specific intent of identifying artificial structures rather than the incidental resource discovery-oriented surveys that have produced the anomaly data we currently have access to. This would require political will, institutional commitment, and a willingness to confront whatever the survey revealed. The oral traditions of the First Nations of Canada need to be systematically documented, cross-referenced, and taken seriously as historical sources rather than mythological or literary artifacts. This work is already beginning in a limited way, driven partly by the legal recognition of Indigenous land rights and the consequent need to understand Indigenous knowledge of the land. But it needs to be extended specifically to the traditions about underground infrastructure and about the predecessors who built it. The tunnel sections that have been sealed, incorporated, or simply left uninvestigated during construction and mining projects need to be identified, where the records still exist, and subjected to proper archaeological investigation. This is not a vast project. The number of specifically documented anomalous sections is large enough to be significant, but not so large that investigating all of them would be an impossible undertaking. The government records that have been redacted or withheld in response to access to information requests related to underground geological surveys need to be released, not in the interest of sensationalism, in the interest of the public's right to understand the physical nature of the country it inhabits. None of this is radical. All of it is consistent with the normal process of scientific and historical inquiry. What is radical is the implication that this inquiry might confirm. But science does not get to choose which implications it investigates based on how comfortable or uncomfortable those implications might be. The tunnels are there. The evidence is pointing at them. The questions are valid. The investigation needs to happen. We began this documentary underground with a door that cannot be opened from the inside. We are going to end it there too. Somewhere beneath Canada, beneath the cities, beneath the prairies, beneath the boreal forest and the rock-rimmed lakes of the Shield and the peaks of the coast mountains, there are doors. They were sealed by people who understood something we are only beginning to understand again. That civilizations are not permanent, that the accumulation of knowledge and capability that we call progress is not an upward line extending indefinitely into the future. It is a cycle. It rises and it falls and it rises again, each time from whatever the previous iteration managed to preserve. The previous iteration preserved what it could. It went underground. It sealed the doors. It trusted that something would come after it that would eventually be ready to open them. We are what came after. Whether we are ready is the question that this documentary cannot answer. It is a question that the investigation of the tunnels will not settle, regardless of what is found inside them. It is a question that humanity has to answer for itself, not about its technical capability, but about its intention, about what it would do with knowledge that fundamentally reframes its own history and its own place in the arc of time on this planet. Would we receive it as a gift, as an inheritance from people who cared enough about the future to preserve it? Or would we receive it as a weapon, as a resource to be controlled, as one more advantage for the powerful to leverage over the powerless? The civilization that built the tunnels made a judgment about when it would be appropriate to release what it had stored. Whatever mechanism they built into the system, whatever lock, whatever threshold, whatever condition had to be met before the doors could be opened from the outside, reflected their answer to that question. Their answer was, not yet. Maybe their answer now is soon. Or maybe their answer is, when you figure out how to ask the question. We are asking the question. Beneath the country that we walk across, beneath the ground that generations of Canadians have called home, beneath the shield that was old before the first human ancestor stood upright on the plains of Africa, the sixth civilization is waiting. It built something. It left it for us. We just have to be ready to find it, and then to understand what finding it means. The doors are down there. The question is whether we are ready for what is behind them. That question is ours to answer. Not theirs, ours. We are the seventh civilization. The sixth is waiting to meet us. If this documentary made you look differently at the ground beneath your feet, at the country you thought you knew, at the history you thought was complete, then it did its job. The evidence is real. The questions are real. The investigation has barely begun. What happens next depends on how many of us are asking the questions. Subscribe and stay with us, because this story is not over. It is just starting to come to the surface.